National Guard troops and even the Marines are on the streets of Los Angeles, deployed by President Donald Trump after mass protests against his immigration raids. California's governor is suing him while protests spread elsewhere. Could this crisis worsen? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. U.S. President Donald Trump has made immigration a huge part of his domestic agenda. His federal agents have stepped up their raids on homes, workplaces, schools, and other areas in recent weeks. But what's happened in California in the last few days seems to have brought the crackdown to a new level. Trump has deployed National Guard troops and U.S. Marines despite the objections of the state governor. In response, California has launched a lawsuit. Meanwhile, the protests are spreading to other cities. Supporters of the president have welcomed the raids, saying they're long overdue, while opponents accuse Trump of authoritarian tactics and creating chaos. So how significant are these events in California? And does Trump's use of the military against civilians pose a challenge to the state's authority? And how is the U.S. public seeing all of this? We'll get to our guests shortly. First, this report from Ama Boateng.
Detentions, protests, and a crackdown. Parts of Los Angeles in California have seen several nights of unrest as President Trump pursues his deportation plans against undocumented migrants. The protest began on Friday after federal immigration officials carried out raids across the city, including workplaces. And the Trump administration's decision to deploy both the National Guard and Marines without the approval of state officials has outraged many. President Trump has defended the decision.
If I didn't get involved, if we didn't bring the Guard in, and we would bring more in if we needed it, because we have to make sure there's going to be law and order. You had a disaster happening. I wouldn't call it quite an insurrection, but it could have led to an insurrection. I mean, that was a lot of harm that was going on last night. I watched it very closely, and it was amazing that the job that the National Guard did. And by the way, the police were working very hard also.
California is suing the federal government, arguing the deployment of National Guard troops is illegal and a violation of the state's sovereignty. The governor, Gavin Newsom, has called it reckless, and the mayor of Los Angeles blames the Trump administration for the escalation in violence.
I am hopeful that the federal government will hear our plea, stop the raids. This is creating fear and chaos in our city. It makes me feel like our city is actually a test case for what happens when the federal government moves in and takes the authority away from the state or away from local government.
We don't want them.
President Trump has said he's aiming to detain 3,000 undocumented migrants a day as part of his campaign pledge to deport up to 1 million undocumented people within a year. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the U.S. and has the largest Latino population. Anger has spread beyond Los Angeles, with protests in other states, including New York and Texas. Many migrants say they fear being targeted by the authorities and are worried about what the future holds for them and their families. Ama Boateng, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. They're all joining us from the United States. In Los Angeles is Peter Eliasberg, who's chief counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California. In Philadelphia, Claire Finkelstein, a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. And in Washington, D.C., Mark Feifley, a Republican strategist, founder and president of Off the Record Strategies. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Peter, let me start with you in Los Angeles. Can you give us a sense of the mood on the ground? What are people saying? Are they afraid? Are they defiant or indifferent to the military buildup?
Well, I think there's both fear and defiance, and they're very angry because what the president has done is unprecedented. This is the first time in 65 years the president has set a National Guard over the objection of the governor and local officials. And what we're seeing, which is so troubling, is he claims to want to restore law and order, but this is a man who didn't want to send out the National Guard on January 6th. So it's a little hard to take that claim seriously. But the other thing is what we're seeing is many video reports, and I've done interviews with people where the greatest force and violence is being actually meted out by federal officers, people shooting tear gas canisters at people's heads and things like that. So this is not an effort to restore law and order. This is an effort to further his political agenda, and there is a lot of anger about it.
Yeah, Peter, Kristi Noem, the Homeland Secretary, has said that the demonstrations in Los Angeles were being paid, the demonstrators rather, were being paid, and that the protests are, in her words, an operation professionally done. What do you respond to that?
It's preposterous. I've been a First Amendment lawyer for 30 years. I work with protesters all the time. The government continually trots out this claim. Where is the money coming from? Who's getting paid? It's absurd on its face, the claims that the government makes about paid protesters.
All right, Mark, let me come to you in Washington, D.C. President Trump promised to restore law and order and crack down on illegal immigration. Would you say that what we're seeing in Los Angeles now is him delivering on that promise, or has he gone too far?
I think what Mr. Trump does is an almost unprecedented campaign of taking a machete to where a scalpel is appropriate to this challenge, and avoiding any type of a bipartisan compromise, as pretty much every president and many people on both political parties have done since my service in government during the Bush administration. We wanted a deal as well. At the end of George Bush's administration, of course, it was not approved. A group of 8 came in 2013, an attempt to bring a bipartisan compromise. That was shot down then, mostly by Republicans. In my time in office, it was Democrats. And then we have Biden's last year in office, in which he was unpopular. We're in the middle of a presidential campaign. And then the Democrats decided, you know what, we need to come up with a compromise solution. They brought in a really respected and hardworking Republican senator by the name of Langsford from Oklahoma. And that was a failure as well. Who's winning in this process is the cartels. They are becoming rich. They are reaping in billions of dollars off of the inaction and the inability of America's political leaders to come together for a compromise.
Let me ask you this. You say this chaos, Mark, is a result of years of bipartisan failure on immigration, but does the military-style response by the Trump administration really help fix that? I mean, don't you think it's a bridge too far to send in the Marines?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's bringing in a machete for when what you need a surgical operation to take the bad elements of the immigration, the illegal immigrants who are creating the human trafficking, who are running fentanyl and other drugs into this country, and who are creating serious crimes and difficulties for our society. Those are the people that need to be removed. And if the challenge is that when these cities become sanctuary cities in many cases, and I believe that every community has a right to operate in the way that it sees fit. But when they are a sanctuary city, that means that ICE agents and other federal authorities have to go into the communities directly without the help and support of local law enforcement. And that means that they round up pretty much whoever they find who is an illegal alien because they do not have an active visa or other legal papers, and they deport them. And that's where the struggle is in these communities. If they worked hand in hand with law enforcement, they would have the ability to then go in and work with them to take the bad elements of that part out and remove them. But we don't have that because of that ineffective leadership across our political spectrum.
All right, Claire, let me bring you into the conversation and ask you about the legality of bringing in the Marines and also the National Guard. Is the president's use of federal military assets in the domestic context, particularly without the governor's consent in California, is that legally on shaky grounds? I mean, or does the existing precedent give him wide leeway to do this?
Well, as you know, there's been a lawsuit by the state of California to challenge this particular takeover of their National Guard. And the curious thing is the way that the federal government did it in this case, because they used a rarely used statute, which is 10 U.S.C. 12406. There's only been one other time in our history that the federal government has decided to federalize troops using that statute. So that's the first problem with this action. And California is alleging that that statute does not authorize this particular takeover because there needs to be a rebellion on the ground in California in order for the president to have the right to federalize troops in this case. And arguably what's gone on in California to now does not meet that standard. The second problem with the particular use of 12406 is that the troops were supposed to be run through the governor according to that statute, it was supposed to be done and the troops dispatched in coordination with the governor, and that didn't happen in this case. And even the president's own order, executive order through which the initial troops were dispatched, made reference to coordination with the governor, and that didn't happen. So California is alleging that it's an illegal dispatch in this particular case.
So how would you say that California's case is strong then? I mean, and what precedent might it set for the balance of power between states and the federal government?
I think California does have a pretty good case. The only precedent is during the Nixon era, when Nixon used 12406 to dispatch the mail to call in to federalize National Guard in order to make sure that the mail was being delivered during a postal strike. So it's a little curious that the federal government decided to proceed this way, because the usual way might have been the Insurrection Act. And ironically, Trump would have been on stronger ground probably had he invoked the Insurrection Act. And of course, it's important to mention that under 12406, there was no exception to what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, under which troops are not allowed to serve as law enforcement agents. Right. And so they're very hamstring in what they can do under the current deployment.
Peter, what's your legal assessment of Governor Newsom's lawsuit? Could it realistically prevent federal troop deployments in the future, or is this merely symbolic right now?
Well, there's not a lot of precedent in interpreting these statutes, but I do think the governor's got a strong legal position. But I think more importantly, we really have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? And there is no reason for it. The governor has made very clear, and it's clear on the ground, yes, there is some unrest. There are some people breaking laws. The Los Angeles Police Department has said, however, most people are protesting peacefully. The idea that this is an insurrection is laughable. We have seen unrest in cities across the country. Local law enforcement has training to handle that. That's not what military troops do. And the idea that the Marines, whose job is to kill people, are being brought in to address this situation is a very frightening possibility. And I worry that really what's happening here is that the federal government is taking steps that will make this far worse, not better. The idea of President Trump restoring law and order is, as I said, laughable. This is a man who thought January 6th was a day of love. This is an effort on him to further his political agenda, not restore order, which local law enforcement has more than the capacity to handle.
Mark, what do you respond to that? Peter asks a very important question. Why is this happening now? I mean, President Trump has long talked about using military force on domestic soil to crush protests or riots. He didn't do it in his first term. Why is he doing it now? What's different?
The administration right now is using the National Guard and the 700 Marines as political props. As I think, as the other two guests rightly said, there's very little they can do. They're essentially doing traffic or maybe some other tasks that are non-law enforcement type activities. Mr. Trump is going into a very difficult, strange waters. In my time in working in the government, we did try and move National Guard and other assets into, for example, New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And when the then governor of Louisiana and the mayor rejected that idea, the chaos happened. So there is, now it's much difficult from a protest to a natural disaster, of course, an extreme difference. But that precedent of moving military people in is very disconcerting and I think quite troubling.
You say political props. He's using the military for political props, but to what end? I mean, he's facing multiple crises right now, the trade war with China being one of them. Can he manage all this while, escalating conflict in California as well? What is he trying to distract Americans from?
So I think it's an old Democratic chief of staff to President Obama who said, don't let any serious crisis go to waste. And Mr. Trump is unfortunately taking that to the extreme. And Mr. Newsom as well is, in some ways, I don't think he enjoys this, but he's taking it from the standpoint of he's also essentially running for president at this point for the Democratic nomination. He set up a podcast. He's changed many of his political kind of more woke ideas to more center and mainstream. Ms. Bass, the mayor in some ways is in political trouble because of her handling of the recent wildfires in and around Los Angeles. So all of this is festering, all of this tension that came about from Mr. Trump's election, from the difficulties that the Democrats have had in putting together a political message for leadership going into its midterm elections next year. And then you have this attempt by Mr. Trump, as you rightly stated, to have multiple things going on in multiple parts of the world and in the country. That's what he thrives on. That type of chaos is what he believes and he thinks is what will help propel him and his team and the people that support him into action for the upcoming year and beyond.
Claire, do you agree with that all of this is really political theater? And what do you think, Claire, Congress and courts should be doing right now to address this breakdown between state and federal authority before this sets a precedent?
I think it's political theater, but it's very dangerous political theater. It's important to note in the current situation that though 4,000 California guardsmen have been deployed, most of them are standing idly by. Only about 300 of them are actually in use right now. And
what's your understanding of their rules of engagement?
So I haven't seen the rules of engagement, but what's very important to note is that, as I mentioned before, under the Posse Comitatus Act, they're not allowed to engage in any law enforcement. I don't want to minimize the law enforcement issues that the LAPD is facing. However, it is up to the governor to decide whether or not to call in the California National Guard. And I have no doubt that Governor Newsom would have called in the California National Guard if he felt he needed them. That's what governors do all the time. Or if he felt he needed federalized troops, he would have reached out to President Trump to say, hey, like it during the Rodney King riots, to say we need support here. But the law enforcement problems are not so significant that California couldn't handle it. And indeed, the federal government seems to acknowledge that by calling out all these troops and then having them stand by. What is the point of calling out 4,000 National Guard troops and having only 300 of them on the ground, and then call out all the Marines, 700 Marines on top of that, and then have them called out under a legal authority under which they're not allowed to do anything? That really weighs in on the political theater side, but it's very similar to the fight with universities, for example, with Harvard University, where when Harvard opposed the measures that the Trump administration was placing on them, the Trump administration upped the ante. So it's a kind of contest between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom, and it's very personalized. The president has said he's going to come arrest the governor.
He has threatened to arrest the governor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he has threatened to arrest the governor. Peter, I think Claire made an important point by saying this is a dangerous political theater, and we cannot forget the people who are affected by all these decisions. What are you hearing from the communities affected by these ICE raids? I mean, the immigrant families, how are they affected by the raids and the deployment of these troops? How has their life changed in recent weeks and recent months?
Well, there's terror, there's uncertainty, there's, heavily armored ICE vehicles going through the streets, and the promise of, or claim, the President Trump that he's only going after the bad guys. I mean, people are hardworking people who are in jobs.
Who is he going after?
Los Angeles are getting torn. Well, certainly not this claim, the bad guys. I mean, literally working families, people who are working in garment shops in downtown Los Angeles. I mean, they raided a Home Depot. And this is not where you find the fentanyl traffickers and the people who are doing, engaged in serious crime. So again, this is the claim that this is an attempt to make everybody safe just doesn't stand up to who's going after it. We're hearing stories all the time. I mean, kids being taken away from their parents and so on. And it's really distressing. And Los Angeles is an immigrant community and one that has thrived. And this is not helping in any way, shape, or form.
But Peter, let me just make myself the devil's advocate here for a second. I mean, a recent poll shows that 54% of Americans support this decision by the Trump administration to deport illegal immigrants. Is there a risk of underestimating how much support this show of force might have with Trump's base and undecided voters in the U.S. and Americans in general?
Well, to me, the issue is not how it polls. The issue of whether it's right and wrong. What he's doing is dangerous. He's bringing federal troops who are using excessive force, federal ICE officials using excessive force. And he is, again, doing something that no president has done in 65 years. He's overbearing on the authority of state and local officials to do their jobs. So to me, it's not about how it polls. It's about whether this is right or wrong, dangerous or not. And it's a dangerous political act that he's engaged in.
All right. Do you think, Peter, Mark, that the administration is concerned at all by this, that this might actually, this heavy-handed response could alienate people and lead to further opposition to President Trump from, all segments of American society on other issues as well?
I think as long as the American economy is operating efficiently and the numbers are good, unemployment, prices, inflation, that sort of thing.
Are the numbers good, though?
Leeway to do these types of to be determined. Not as good as they should be or they could be. I think the tariff war has had a negative effect on the economy at this point, and I think that's Mr. Trump's problem. Is that he should be focused on the economy, getting the bad guys out in immigration, and focusing on that. I think instead it's just igniting this, which really this issue propelled him into office. It propelled him to the Republican nomination and then the presidency in his first term. He sees this as his defining issue, and he has really turned it from something that was more of a non-issue of sorts, except in like areas of the Republican Tea Party and other places. And he's turned it into as you said, a 55-45 issue on his favor. In the short term, it looks like it's helping him, I guess. But I think in the long term, as we said, there's organizations, organized crime getting rich. I think China is quite happy that this is the America that they're seeing. They're continuing to move fentanyl equipment into various areas such as Mexico, and that is what is killing 100,000 people per year in the United States. That is what Mr. Trump should be focused on. That's what the Democrats and Republicans should be focused on. Right now, they're not. We're all talking about political props of unfortunate and I think wrong-minded military people in Southern California when they should be out supporting and continuing to support our freedoms overseas.
Claire, what does this moment tell us about American democracy and where it's headed?
I think this is one of the most dangerous moments and one of the most dangerous fights that Trump is picking with independent sources of power. There's the fight with the universities, there's the fight with the law firms, but this is the most dangerous one because he's really waging a war to try to roll back the longstanding tradition of an independent military, a non-political military in particular. And that's been a tradition that's kept us safe domestically and overseas. So in other states, what he's done is to demand that the National Guards lend themselves in what's called state active duty to his service to assist with immigration roundups. So Texas, Florida, and a number of other states have entered into agreements and said, yeah, take our National Guard. You can use them for your own purposes. And that's exactly where he wants to be. He doesn't want any independent sources of power. And that's very damaging for our whole structure of checks and balances, the vertical checks and balances, which have been a very important part of our democracy, where states form an independent check on the federal government and where governors get to control the National Guard and get to police crime in their own states. And the whole tradition of civilian military relations is at stake here. Right. So there are major issues in our democracy that are being rethought and recast by actions like this.
All right. Peter, your thoughts. What does this tell us about the state of American democracy today and where it's headed? And what kind of long-term damage do you think this could inflict on the military's independence and the broader principle of civilian control over armed forces?
Well, I very much agree with the previous comments. It's a very dangerous thing the president's doing. We have a very, very long and good tradition that the military doesn't do local law enforcement. They're not a political arm of the administration. But the president seems to think that every part of the federal government is just his arm to use for his purposes and for his advancement. And I think it's a very threatening moves that he's making and a very dangerous time for American democracy. I absolutely agree. It's a scary time.
We're seeing similar anti-ICE protests prop up in other cities like New York and San Francisco. Do you think this could be the start of a coordinated movement, Peter, a unifying platform for people to protest against Donald Trump?
I mean, I'm not big on reading political tea leaves and polls, but I do sense a lot of anger and a lot of sense that people thought, this isn't what I voted for, this isn't what I thought. I didn't think what we were going to get is Marines patrolling in cities across the country.
Right.
So I think it certainly has the potential to galvanize a lot of opposition.
Okay, Mark, you have the final word. You voted for Donald Trump, I understand. Is this what you expected?
I think that what the challenge that Mr. Trump has is that he did receive the votes of numerous people that were of Latino descent, and that if Mr. Trump is seen as going into these areas and rounding up people, and that's a continued activity that happens over the weeks and the months ahead, Mr. Trump is going to see that in his polling data. He's going to see that as a negative thing that's happening that could bring about a Republican House, Republican Senate, or a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and hurt the chances of whoever his predecessor might be, Mr. Vance, Mr. Rubio, whoever that is. And then he might change his thoughts on this. At this point, I think he's riding this out, and I think it's unfortunate.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for a very, very good conversation about this. Thank you, Peter Eliasberg, Claire Finkelstein, and Mark Fifley. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And, of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Bat-Tibor, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.